to Simple Conversations with ASG.
So there's always this dynamic with bands and musicians where a talented musician enters a band, especially back in those times and probably before 2000 where boy bands were more popular, and they assemble that crew around them they are great at the things they're not quite good at and they don't really want to take the time to learn. Obviously back then all the boy bands needed a front man. Maybe wasn't as musically talented as other people, but they brought the energy, they brought the excitement. They were the people people would pay to see just to come out to because their energy was insane. Robbie Williams talks about it in his movie where when Gary Barlow started singing alongside him, he almost grew a resentment for him because Gary was the person in the papers, he was the person in the magazines. They wanted to talk to him because he was the guy getting the crowds going. And there is this speculation a lot online. Obviously, it can't really come to an end because John's not here anymore, but that John and Paul really always butted heads. They never fully saw eye to eye because of what you're talking about. John probably didn't feel like he was getting as musically fulfilled from the Beatles as he should have. Do you think that because Paul was the front man and he was the person in the headlines, John kind of resented that because he got on the music for that kind of reason?
No, I don't think so. I think because they needed each other a lot when they started out. They couldn't have done it without each other. And when they did become big, which in the UK was in 63, John was still very much the leader. He was still, if they had one, the front man. You know, he stood on his own. Paul and George were the supporting cast. And Paul didn't have a massive problem with that. They worked so well together. You know, the songwriting in those first few years was pretty equal. I think it's then, as they're starting to do more and more writing alone, and then the other would maybe help finish a song off, that's when the partnership then frays a little bit. But certainly at the beginning, they were best friends. They did so much. I mean, they almost put an end to the Beatles in 61. When John was 21 and he got £100 at his birthday, he decided that he and Paul would just go off and hitchhike into Europe. With leaving Pete Best and George Harrison here in Liverpool, cancelled gigs, and off they went hitchhiking, ended up in Paris and just stayed in Paris. Ironically, that's where they then got their, what became famous, mop-top haircuts in Paris at the end of 61. So the two of them were really close. There had been an issue out in Hamburg when Stuart Sutcliffe joined the group, because Stuart became John's best mate, and Paul resented Stuart for that, and he was jealous of that relationship and was partially responsible for encouraging Stuart to leave before he was kicked out. So that then brings John and Paul closer together again, and their songwriting, certainly going through into the early to the mid-60s, that partnership was very important. That then changes really when they stop touring, so not spending as much time together. They're off doing solo projects. And then once Yoko comes into the picture, John, as I was saying, he gets obsessed. He then decides he wants to spend every minute of every day with Yoko. So that's, again, slips in the middle between John and Paul, and that then never healed itself again. So they needed each other, but I think John could operate more on his own. I think Paul needed John more than John needed Paul by then.
Do you think then the other band members, you obviously mentioned a few that they came and went, but Ringo and George obviously stayed most of the test of time. Do you think that they maybe felt like taking a backseat wasn't quite for them because they obviously broke apart before the Beatles officially kind of went to dust?
Well, I think if you look back, when they signed the first, get the record deal, the first single comes out beginning of October 62. At that point, when they sign their proper management agreement with Brian Epstein, they also have John and Paul signing their publishing deal. By doing that, so much of the income for the records is going to John and Paul as joint songwriters, and immediately that relegates George to a lesser role in the group. And of course, Ringo's only just joined a few weeks before. But at that point, 1st of October 62, you're already separating from being 4 of them to being 2 and 2. And George had this problem because he was so young. You know, when he joins, he's only 14 and John was 17. And it took John 2 or 3 times for him to accept George and say, okay, you can join the group, because he was so good on guitar. But that was a big issue. And Paul always treated George like a younger brother. That never improved, as we saw by the time they're doing the Let It Be sessions, and George has had enough. And he's just fed up of being spoken to like the kid and being told how to play guitar, even though George was a better guitarist than John or Paul. And he says, I've had enough, see you around the clubs, and off he goes. Ringo was different because George had been in the Quarrymen from the end of 1957. There was a long history of John, Paul and George together. Ringo only joins in August 62, just before the first record comes out. So he doesn't have that backstory with the other three. And by his personality, he was always happy just to sit at the back. And that's one of the great things about his drumming style, was that he knew how to play the right rhythm for the right song. He never wanted to dominate with the drums. And one of his great phrases was, just because there's a moment of silence doesn't mean it needs to be filled. And that's why he was such a popular drummer, and people tried to emulate everything that he did. So he tended to be the peacemaker. But even he's had enough when they're making the White Album. And he's just, because he was bored, because they're not touring. And so the others, they sit around in the studio for hours and hours, days and days on end. And he'd take a book to read, or he'd go and play chess, or just go off and do something, because he wasn't needed for ages. And he just thought, what's the point of doing this? And off he went, and he quit, but then was brought back in. So you could tell, really from the end of 67, after Brian dies, that's when everything started to get fractured. And really, that's the beginning of the end, even though he didn't realize it at the time. When you look back, you can see that's when everything sort of goes downhill.